This is the second season, quote unquote, of PFC's Webinar Wednesdays. We're going to be talking about Mind the Gap, the state of philanthropy and the Black community. Issues, obstacles, lived experience. I mean, if we look at the last 2 weeks, a lot of things have occurred. We think that we're moving forward. Anami Paul, less than 2 weeks ago, was elected as the first Black Jewish leader of a federal party. Mazel tov to that. October, for those that aren't familiar, is Islamic Heritage Month in Canada and across the country. There's a lot of Black Muslims that are being highlighted and celebrated, but we're not yet done. There's still so much to do in the Canadian landscape. And here it says Black community as a title, but we're talking about Black communities. Not all the voices are going to be heard today, but we're acknowledging that we still need to start a conversation, have a conversation, and include multiple individuals in that conversation. We're going to be chatting about the relationship between philanthropy, Black communities, and why is that broken? We're going to talk about equity. We're going to talk about lessons learned and what it looks like for Black Canadians right now. Before we begin, I am just going to mention that there is the Q&A function that you can click on and ask questions. We're going to have about a 15 to 20 minutes reserved at the end for questions from the audience. Feel free to use the chat to engage with the other speakers, and you will receive slides with the full biographies of our guests in the automatic email with the recording. So before we start off, I just want to read our virtual land acknowledgement, where we would like to acknowledge the many territories of Turtle Island on which we work and reside. These territories are home to many Indigenous peoples who have lived here for tens of thousands of years and continue to live here. As settlers, immigrants, and descendants, and as visitors, we honor and respect the many Indigenous peoples of this land and territory and hope for a more just future together. Before I delve into chatting about who our guests are, I just wanted to say a thank you to Rebecca, who helped me with this lovely webinar and the construction of it, and chatting with our guests, and Merve as well on the PFC team. Who do we have today? So we have Liban Abakor, he's the Executive Director of Youth Leaps. We have Jacob Leamare, Community Grants Associate at the Calgary Foundation. We have Sabzia Zaman, the CEO of the Inspirit Foundation. And we have, oh, my phone just went off, Joseph Smith, the Executive Director of Generation Chosen. And as I had mentioned, their full biographies are going to be shared not only in the chat box, but also in slides to come. Let's start this conversation. I'm very excited. I want to stop talking because I want to hear what folks have to say about this very first discussion question, being, how well do we feel the philanthropic sector supports Black Canadians and their priorities, and why do you think that is? Just as a reminder, each of you have a nice 5 minutes to address these topics. Jacka, would you like to go first, please?
Sure, thanks Jean-Cyril for the introduction, and thanks everyone for joining us today for this very important conversation. You'll see in my bio that my background is primarily in grant making. I have about 15 years of experience doing that. So I'll be sharing a lot of my perspective as a grant maker over the years. And in terms of this question, I think that there is, just as the title shows, there's a real gap between, the objectives of the philanthropic sector and the needs of Black Canadians and the support that's being provided. There's definitely a lot of room for improvement, and the statistics on philanthropic support of Black-led and Black-serving organizations across Canada show that philanthropy has not been taking an equitable approach when it comes to supporting Black Canadians. So over my 15 years as a grant maker, I've witnessed and I've experienced systemic racism, anti-Black racism, and ultimately a lack of interest in supporting Black Canadians. And there's a number of challenges and barriers that I've witnessed and have also been guilty of over the years as a funder. So some of those would be that as a funder, we often have a limited view of organizational capacity that is focused on an applicant's ability to manage a project, fundraise, or write a proposal versus their ability to reach the most marginalized people in Black communities. gaining and maintaining their trust, providing the services they need as opposed to the services the organization offers, and most importantly, providing culturally informed services. Also, Black Canadians are often lumped in with immigrant communities, which ignores the realities of non-immigrant Black Canadians. And often support comes through diversity initiatives, which perpetuates the othering of our realities. So, and often I think as funders, we're not willing to take a chance on unknowns. So Black-led organizations are often in this vicious circle of needing to prove their capacity before they can get funding, but needing funding to help build their capacity. And I think there's also this view within philanthropy that we're not in the business of creating new charities or nonprofits. There are already too many. So therefore, any new individuals should look to join or partner with existing services, or we should invest in changing mainstream organizations so that they better serve Black communities because they already have a level of capacity. I think, you know, the message that we're giving today is that this really isn't meeting the needs of Black communities. There's also, you know, kind of a limited number of qualified donees and within Black communities. So this puts a limitation in the ability for philanthropic organizations to support them. And in my experience, due to the inequitable investments and supports, many Black-led organizations require additional capacity building and navigation support to access resources. And often this additional support is dependent on the personal will of the few Black staff within a philanthropic or funding organization, rather than an intentional commitment or equitable approach from the organization. And then finally, I'd say that there's a lack of targeted outreach to Black communities, and there's a need to develop authentic relationships and build trust on both sides. You know, because Black leaders often lack those connections and experience with funders to be able to access the resources they need for the work they're trying to do. So.
I can totally hear you when you say that sometimes it does feel to a certain extent tokenistic. I'm paraphrasing some of the proposed that you brought to the table, but I'd love to hear Joseph Smith's perspective on it as a Black-led community organizer or organization, Generation Chosen. How do you see this question?
Thank you so much. I don't know if it's the 4 espressos in my coffee, the beautiful face I'm seeing here, or the question being posed, but I'm really jacked to be here right now and answer some of these questions. So thank you so much for creating this forum and this place for us to communicate. So as you expressed, I'm the executive director of a nonprofit organization called Generation Chosen, which is rooted within the Jane and Finch community within Toronto. And we focus on 4 main things: mental health, emotional intelligence, financial literacy and life skills, and civic engagement. And we've been doing this work for youth and young adults within the Jane and Finch corridor for about 4 years, going on 5. And we were only funded for 1 year out of those 4 years going on 5. And so what happened for the other 3 years, you ask? Well, I'm about to tell you. The first 3 years of us programming, we had to fund the entire program out of our own pockets. So I am a contract professor, I'm a high school teacher, trained to teach from kindergarten all the way to high school. And I also do speaking engagements on the side, and I work for Manon Chappelle and some other political work. And so I had to pretty much work more if I really wanted to launch this idea. And I was taking money from my other jobs to fund this nonprofit. And so I ended up spending $30,000 of my own money for 3 years, so $10,000 each year, to make sure that the program could run. And so the program works whereby every single week, about 150 to 200 young people come and utilize our services. So we're typically in a physical space where we provide snacks, gym equipment for games, video games, ping pong tables, and then our actual educational seminars in the areas of mental health and emotional intelligence and the pillars I expressed before. Now we're all virtual. Still doesn't change the workload. But those 3 years were grueling, and we applied for a YOF OTF grant all 3 of those formal years, and we couldn't get any funding. And it could be because of the nuance of the idea with regards to emotional intelligence. Back in 2016, people weren't really talking about that. However, I think it's for the following reasons. Young people that we deal with who are under 25 often say, the job wants work experience before I can get the job, but I can't get work experience unless they give me the job. So what am I going to do? It's very much the same with young Black people trying to fund their nonprofit ideas. You can't get funded until you've gotten funded. And people want to see a track record and a history of you being funded by other sources to add to your credibility and to add to the value of you getting the money that they're about to give you. So that was one of the first issues. How do we legitimize ourselves? How do we get people to recognize that we are a worthy cause for them to donate money to? And that required us accessing media and doing all sorts of speaking engagements to kind of put the idea out there. But we had to work doubly as hard as other people to acquire the attraction and attention we needed to get our first big grant. And then since then, we've been able to receive more money to do our work. The other issue, and the second point, is where do you go to get this money? I was born and raised in the Jane and Finch community, did all my schooling there. Not once did I hear about the philanthropic sector or about individuals within the philanthropic sector, institutions I could access and connect to. None of this information was given to me in my civics and career class, maybe because civics and careers is only 0.5 of a credit, but we can talk about that on another webinar. None of this was given to me. And so I had to do my own research. And I found out through engaging with other organizations that there are whole teams of people, 5 to 6 people working behind the scenes, getting grants out. And I was like, I'm one person. I co-founded the program with 2 other people, but none of us had any clue about this information. So I had to research it. And I had to work like 6 people, constantly sending out applications and making sure my verbiage was just right. Because if you slip up on a sentence or a word or a statement here or there, people will be less inclined to fund you. And I didn't realize those dynamics of the entire process. I had to learn through trial and error for 3 years. And so that's quite difficult. And if I had been aided with the information prior to, I might have been able to avoid some of those obstacles. The last thing is about predictability. So we received a scale grant for about 4 years. And that big grant allowed us to acquire other resources. But now we're operating in light of that big scale grant. How can we ensure that we'll be able to continuously receive monies like that to operate at the high level and produce services that are of the quality that we want to produce? It's hard to gauge. Where else do we go to ensure that there's longevity to the funding that we're receiving? Often what happens in lower income communities is that nonprofits rise up and they die really quickly within 4 or 5 years on account of them not being able to sustain the resource component of their offerings. And so it's hard to know who to go to ensure that there's longevity to your service offerings. And when those services get taken out of a community, young people suffer. And we deal with issues that we're dealing with right now in the city of Toronto. And for our particular area with gun and gang violence, when you have a dearth of services in the community, these are the kind of results that occur on account of other systemic forces and issues. And so those are my 3 things with regards to being a person that's an organizer trying to start their own nonprofit organization. And this is why I joined the BCPF.
I'm loving everything that you're sharing with us right now. I'd love to see the counter of that in Sadzia, if you could chat about with the In Spirit Foundation. I know that there's a lot of anti-oppressive work, anti-Islamophobia. There is engagement with Black Canadians. Can you chat a bit about your response to how you felt when you saw this question? And you're on mute, so let's unmute first.
Sorry, I'm just trying to compete with Joseph and his 4 espressos. The passion is really coming through. So thank you for that, Joseph. First of all, let me tell you a little bit about the foundation. The foundation funds media and arts for social change. And part of that is also supporting young content creators. We work primarily in the area of narrative power and the shifting of narrative power. And that becomes an important element in this conversation in terms of the sector. I'm coming from outside the sector, which in some ways has been a real gift. I'm not connected deeply within the sector. I have completely an outsider's view of it, and really, really helpful for lots of reasons. The sectors that I've worked in previously have virtually no BIPOC leadership. That would be within the media sectors, as well as arts and culture. The leadership, there's a dearth of leadership that's of color. Philanthropy is even worse than the sectors that I came from. And so I think that was my first big learning, was it was quite shocking. I think I had an assumption that perhaps philanthropy was better than some of the other sectors that I'd come from. This becomes a very, very crucial issue, because those who lead actually frame the things that we believe to be important, those that are worthy. those that are connected to our own experiences of whether it's racism or other forms of oppression. And if we don't get that at a leadership, in a leadership role, there is not the ability to build those networks within leadership. The networks that are so crucial within this sector, actually much more crucial within this sector than in the others that I've been to. It's much more connected, it's much more insular. And so the absence of the leadership becomes even a bigger problem within a sector that is so interwoven and where the relationships in some cases are generational. And that's a huge systemic barrier. So I see part of the issue is within that systemic barrier piece. I also want to talk a little bit about narrative power and how that applies to philanthropy, and particularly around racialized communities, Black communities in particular, but also Indigenous communities. We know what happened this summer. The words and images of George Floyd, like we, you know, I think for many people in the world, something shifted. Something changed for many of us. And I think about the power of the image of his murder, and I think about his words and how that has led to a bit of a reckoning. I'm hoping the reckoning will last well beyond this moment. And that's very, very important, because at this moment in time, philanthropy also has the opportunity to take this moment of reckoning and to become representative of the communities that actually live in this country. And in this case, I believe 3.5% of Canadians who are Black or call themselves Black or identify as Black. So I think that there is significant gaps, and the gaps for me are really at the leadership, because that's where the power shifts. That's where the money happens. That's where the decisions get made. And without that, the sector can't, it's really hard to move forward without that piece in the sector being addressed head on. And the one other thing I will say about the sector is that while the other sectors that I've come from have been much more competitive, and I don't see that same level of competitiveness within philanthropy, because I'm not competing with another foundation for funding or resources. I'm not. We're all in a role where we're trying to get money out the door. And that inherent reality of the sector is actually the greatest strength of the sector. We have a way to collaborate. We have the means to collaborate. We don't need to fight for money. And if we don't do that around anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism, Islamophobia, all the important kind of issues of our time, I think that the sector has lost a great opportunity, because we are inherently set up to collaborate. We just have to do it now.
Lots of opportunities for collaboration. It's a great segue, because I'd love for Levant to chat a bit about his reflections on this question, and also maybe opportunities for collaboration that we can see.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. In listening to sort of my colleagues speak, I think it's probably a good place to sort of talk about how this question is a severely understudied area of research. That's why the Black Canadian Philanthropic Foundation, which I have the privilege of being a member of, in collaboration with the Network for the Advancement of Black Communities and the Carleton University's Philanthropy and Not-for-Profit Leadership Program, have been collaborating to help better understand this important question. As a part of our research, we surveyed the grant disbursements of private philanthropic foundations and conducted some key informant interviews where we asked almost an identical variation of this question. And I think it's worth remarking on some of the key findings that emerged from our initial research in order for me to sort of respond or maybe juxtapose some of the important, and I don't want to categorize as anecdotal, but the experiences that my colleagues shared. So in a quick summary of the findings, here's what we learned. Out of the nearly 10,000 public and private foundations in Canada, we were only able to find about a dozen foundations or funding initiatives with a specific mandate to meet the needs of Black Canadians as a whole. Secondly, both public and private foundations in Canada severely underfunded Black and Black-led and Black-serving community organizations, which remain under-resourced and therefore oftentimes unable to deliver on their mandate, which is one of the pieces that my colleague Joseph spoke to. And finally, where foundations have funded Black-led and Black-serving organizations, those funding opportunities appear to be short-term, project-based, rather than operation or sustained or core funding, which is, I think, something that my colleague Jack alluded to, and restricted by the parameters and priorities of that funding institution. So it's not necessarily funding to, poverty alleviation, but it might be funding to the area of an arts program, sports program, or after-school program, given the kind of work that that foundation that's funded them is set out to achieve. And so the question is sort of, why is that? And in part, this has to do with a few general buckets. The first bucket is the lack of diversity within the philanthropic sector, particularly within the decision-making strata of organizations. To borrow the parlance from the Grammys, frankly, philanthropy is so white, right? And this creates blindness in the areas where need may exist, insofar as those needs aren't reflective of those in positions of power and making decisions. We interviewed one of our key informants, and they made a really, really interesting comment that I think I just want to quote. And they said, when the concerned communities are not at the table, the concerns of that community are not on the agenda. And I think that speaks to how the Black Canadian experience within philanthropy has been, where they aren't represented within decision-making spaces, their issues and their concerns aren't addressed. And I think that's a natural sort of result of not having a more inclusive and diverse space, or more greater inclusivity and diversity within the philanthropic sector. Another bucket is, we measure what matters. And frankly, we aren't measuring how well we serve Black Canadians, because that isn't, again, a central mandate for many of the actors within the philanthropic community. This lack of measurement leads to a data gap, which reinforces that blindness that I just referred to, right? And if we don't have the experiences, lived or tacit knowledge at the decision-making levels, and we don't have the data to help us identify where we're not doing well because we're not tracking those things, it's almost as mutually reinforcing dynamic that's created where we don't think anything is, we think we're doing a really good job because those areas we're focusing on are maybe being improved, but the areas where we have a blind spot, we're unaware of, we have this unawareness about what's happening. And that's oftentimes where equity-seeking groups live, specifically, in this case, Black Canadian communities. So I think I would sort of share that to say the data piece is a really, really, really important question. I think most foundations that we've had the conference have the ability to speak with, there's a clear willingness to say, look, where there are gaps, we want to address it. And I think we're in a moment now within the philanthropic sector where there's not only a willingness, but this bold courage to act. And the question for us is, what can help us, what can help reorient, redouble our efforts, and provide us direction on where we need to go? And I think in order to figure out where we need to go, we need to understand where we are today. And that's where some of the data that the BCPF and our colleagues have been collecting will be very useful for folks to really help create the compass forward towards where we want to go to. I do want to caution, however, and say data is not always the crux of everything, right? I think that what you heard from my three colleagues before, while in many ways their information, it stems from their own personal experiences and the data that they use every single day. I think that's more than enough for us to understand that there's, we can start now and the data can help us better understand how to continue to move, but we don't need to necessarily wait for this research. I think we can act today with what we know. And I can say that, we have, at least on my part, some extreme optimism that there's that willingness to move forward, to do, to do the right thing. And for, I think, the sector to recognize the call to action on behalf of the Black Canadian community and improve the way our relationship is happening.
And working in the sector, we notice and we understand the importance of data, but also the lack thereof data, and also the importance of interpretation of data. So we often hear, oh, well, Black Canadians are only 3% of the population, but that piece of data, that percentage isn't the crux of it. It's the underrepresentation or the overrepresentation of populations in other subsets and in other themes. I would love to jump into our second question because we're on time and I'm very happy when we follow schedule. Let me just click on this. What do you think a dedicated Black Canadian philanthropic foundation would mean to Black communities? I'd love to hear back from Jacka. If you'd love to unmute yourself and share some of your perspective from the Calgary Foundation.
Yes, so first of all, a Black Canadian philanthropic foundation would mean philanthropy for Black Canadians by Black Canadians. So nothing for us without us. It will center the voices of Black Canadians and put resources in the hands of Black Canadians for self-determination, really from a community-based approach. And it would also mean a funder that's that's focused exclusively on addressing their needs, rather than needing to constantly justify the need to focus on Black communities and their needs, maybe in competition with other communities. And it also would mean an increase in development of Black leadership and Black-led organizations across Canada, which would strengthen the ecosystem within which we're operating. And it also would mean a funder which incorporates African and Caribbean values of philanthropy. So really diversifying our view of philanthropy and what it has meant traditionally for different communities. And also would mean an increased relationship building and support from the philanthropic sector at large, because a key role that the foundation wants to play is to support philanthropy in strengthening their ability to support Black communities across Canada. So this foundation is not looking to be the only avenue for support for Black Canadians. It's really looking to be a partner with other philanthropic organizations in supporting those communities. Thanks.
Thank you. And we'll hit with the same order. I'd love to hear from the perspective of someone that works on the grassroots within a Black-led organization. Joseph, would you like to give us your opinion on how do you feel this would impact your day-to-day work, there being a Black Canadian foundation or philanthropic foundation, sorry.
Absolutely, thank you so much. So when you are born and raised in a marginalized, underserved community like I have been, and if you manage to surmount the many odds that exist within that community, you often still feel like you're living within or occupying a space that's quite nebulous and adjacent to mainstream society. And the institutions that are charged with servicing you often don't. And so you quite often just feel alone and separated and sequestered from everybody else. A BCPF, a foundation that's philanthropic, that's devoted towards serving the Black community specifically, would almost feel as if there is a beacon of light somewhere else trying to locate you and shine upon you, provide you with opportunities and supports, when often you feel like you're organizing and trying to do things on your own. And it requires almost Herculean strength to complete a task like this when you come from a community like that. And so I think it would take away a lot of the apathy with regards to organizing and creating spaces for young people to overcome the many obstacles they're dealing with on a day-to-day basis, given that they are racialized or come from certain communities like I come from. But it would also give them a sense that there's an institution out there devoted towards specifically helping you. And often we feel that our institutions might market themselves as being ones devoted to helping Black communities or Indigenous communities, but that service and that support doesn't often come as profusely as it needs to come. And so the BCPF would be something where you know that there is a light post somewhere that's trying to access you, and they're trying to market directly to you. And that would just provide a sense of comfort overall.
Thanks, Joseph. Sadia, from the perspective of the In-Spirit Foundation, looking at the landscape and what you've experienced in your years in philanthropy, what would be
yeah.
bring to the table?
I just want to say that I feel like everybody else is best positioned to say what this would mean for Black communities within Canada. So I'm not going to speak on that at all, because that's not my place. However, I will say that within philanthropy, I believe, like many other sectors, there is this, we have a knee-jerk reaction to, if there is more than one, then there is too much. And we only do this with racialized communities. For example, if there are 3 Black philanthropic initiatives underway at this moment, well, you know, there's way too much happening, right? You know, that'll all get figured out. You know, it's lots of people are on this. And we know the data doesn't actually support this. And I think we have to kind of get out of our own headspaces to say, as leaders, to be able to say, it's okay if there are 20 philanthropic initiatives that are dealing with anti-Black racism or other issues that are important to many different communities. It's okay if there's 30. It's, I think we all often come from a headspace of scarcity, which I think can be very dangerous for racialized communities especially. We're not allowed to exist beyond the one of. And I think that that's a sector blind spot that I'm hoping that we can continue to avoid. I know that that certainly in terms of some of our funding around Indigenous initiatives and so on, we have learned so much from the other communities who have been fighting this battle too, right? There's already an organization that does X, Y, Z. And so I'll only say that that's a blind spot within the sector. The other blind spot in the sector around, you know, a Black philanthropic foundation, quite frankly, is also around the regionality of this. This is a big country. And for the most part, the sector can understand big city issues, but it cannot necessarily understand city issues or regional issues at all outside of the big major center. So Jacka, I know that you would know something about this being in Calgary. And as someone who grew up on the prairies, in terms of my lived experience around growing up in a small place in the middle of nowhere, where you're not at all reflected, I think that there are different issues. And those are issues that I believe that within leadership, within the sector, we actually don't have any literacy around. And that's another really important piece, is to have kind of some of those regional, very, very important issues. Like I think of all of the stuff that's happening in Alberta at this moment, and the anti-racism initiatives that are required at this moment especially. I'm not sure that that's on the radar of a foundation that's not in Alberta. So the regionalism piece is huge, and I want to just highlight that as another blind spot. But beyond that, I think everybody else has said what needs to be said.
Thank you for sharing and acknowledging that as well. Not everyone would acknowledge that it's not their place to respond to something, and we love that. Levon, would you like to tackle this question? I'm sure you have a couple of things to say about it, but you're on mute. So I'll let you unmute and keep talking until... Sorry,
yes.
There we go.
Thank you so much. And thank you to my colleagues. And Sadia, thanks for those comments. I think there's you know, courage and power in creating space for others to share their experiences, and you know, validating those experiences by giving them the space to do so, to share it. So I want to acknowledge that that's the kind of leadership that I think the philanthropic sector as a whole will benefit from. So thank you. I would say, if you know, the response maybe is this. I spoke earlier about the research and our findings, and I mentioned that one of the findings is that Black-led and Black-serving organizations receive support in ways that is often short-term, project-based, and restricted by the parameters and priorities of the funding institution. I think a dedicated Black Canadian Philanthropic Foundation would be imperative to prioritize and fulfill the specific needs of Black Canadian communities in the ways that meet their needs, right? And so this could mean innovative grant making models, looking at ways to get resources to communities outside of some of the, the obstructions that they face, such as being a charitable organization. And I also think a dedicated Black foundation goes beyond giving communities a seat at the table. It actually balances power within resource holders and resource users, right? It reframes Black Canadians as being recipients of grants, but also as the actual initiators of that philanthropy. As my colleague Jack has said, it moves the paradigm from philanthropy for Black Canadians and to philanthropy by Black Canadians. And I think that's an incredibly important repositioning that could occur through the existence of a dedicated Black foundation. Additionally to that, through a dedicated Black foundation, Black communities would no longer be beholden to the priorities of the funding institutions themselves, right? Oftentimes we're trying to fit into a box based on available funding. What this would allow is for us to make sure that our funding programs reflect the priorities of Black Canadian communities across this country. And oftentimes those are very diverse and very nuanced, right? And so by having a scope that wide, it would allow us to ensure that we're actually creating the resourcing opportunities for the issues that matter to Black Canadians, and it's not coming from, it's not forcing them to sort of fall into a box, which means that it gives them the chance to chart their own course for long-term social well-being and economic development. And it also allows us to take sort of, a comprehensive, consistent approach to address the needs and priorities of Black Canadians. And therefore, a Black-led foundation would ensure that Black communities across this country have access to resources, are engaging and being served in the way that best suits them, and are sharing knowledge and capacity. It also means the dedicated foundation would also insulate them from the changing winds of both public sentiment and government. We know that as governments change their funding priorities, the areas that they're investing in will also change. So does public sentiment. And we want to ensure that those ebb and flows that are typical of changing sentiment are smoothed out by the existence of a Black foundation that would ensure Black Canadian communities always have a place, a home to always seek resources from. And I think that speaks in many ways to the brilliant commentary offered by my colleague Joseph. I think those are some of the ways that a dedicated Black foundation would benefit not only Black Canadian communities, but I think really the sector as a whole, by also living as a partner that helps them understand where those blind spots exist, helping those foundations within the sector also sort of reorient and redouble their own efforts. And so there's some language, that could be built, some perspectives around shared outcomes that could be gained as well. So I think there are really a tremendous amount of benefits. Only, I think, based on our comments, we're really scratching the surface. And I think to really answer this question, we invite the rest of the Black philanthropic community to join us to say, not only to think about how a dedicated Black foundation could benefit Black Canadians, but how we can work together to strengthen the way that our philanthropic sector supports Canadians in general. And yeah, so I'll end it there.
And I think you put it really well in saying that we're just scratching the surface, because I had that in the beginning. There are a few voices that are missing at the table, but we're still actively searching for those voices to be heard and to be represented. This actually brings us to our Q&A period, which we've gotten a few tweets that I've received in my Twitter inbox. We have some questions in the Q&A box. I'll read the first one that I received here in the Q&A box from Andrea. Hey, Andrea. I know Andrea, she's great, we love her. Great community worker here based in Montreal. I can see a lot of problems with a or a few Black-focused philanthropic foundations, including the diversity of politics, values, and interests. This could easily create an environment in which all Black-run focused organizations are defaulted directly to these foundations and other foundations, example, health focus, etc. We'll divert them directly. Could the panelists address the political and identity related challenges, example, queerness, Black trans folks, disability, in the idea of Black philanthropic foundations? And there's like a side note that says respectability politics in general related to how, where, and what Black communities present. big loaded question, but I love it. Thank you, Andrea. Does anyone want to tackle it? And if so, oh, it's actually Rashenda's question. Thanks, Rashenda. Who wants to tackle that question? If
I'm
anyone.
happy to give it a go.
Go for it.
So I think the answer really lies in the question itself, right? The diversity in the Black Canadian community is rich, right? And we recognize that one dedicated Black Philanthropic Foundation is not intended to be the one fatal swoop, right, to address all of our challenges. It certainly is I would say hopefully a start, and maybe a decent start. So one of the ways that the BCPF specifically is addressing this issue is that we're recognizing the Black community as communities, right? And so we're starting off from our values mission statement, which recognizes orientation, association, it recognizes regionality. And what we're doing in terms of our decision making, specifically when it comes to not only the governance piece, but at our actual participatory grant making, what we've done is we've devised a structure that allows us to have regional advisory committees that are identifying the priorities of Black Canadian communities, and then those communities making the decision themselves around the kinds of projects that are funded based on those priorities that have been identified. And we're going to have to do a lot of work to ensure that those advisory committees are representative, right, of the multiple voices that make up our community. I can assure you right now, in order to answer that question, I hope we never, ever find an answer to it, because an answer to it would mean that at some point, you know, we're not creating the spaces that those separate, distinct, and important groups need to have. And I think that's important to notice. You know, we talked about there will always be a need for, you know, LGBTQ plus communities, right, to have a space on their own and to ensure that their issues are being addressed and their priorities moved forward. And that may not always happen through a dedicated foundation. That may happen through another entity, right? But some of those areas where we have common interests, where there could be a sort of a collective approach, I think that the BCPF can be a good start point. I think the other piece is that the BCPF isn't going to live in an ecosystem by itself. It'll exist within the philanthropic community at large, right? And this is where our collaborative approach and partnership with the larger communities, members in that community, meaning the foundations, is going to be so important, right? So where a Black-focused health organization, it doesn't have to be limited to only coming to us, but we can also then say, look, hey, by the way, Foundation X, Y, and Z who deal with that issue, here's how you guys can support the community. Here's how we can create better pathways to access those resources. So I appreciate the question. And I think it's important that we recognize that that it doesn't matter if we have 30 or 40 foundations. We're never, I don't think we should ever imagine that's ever going to be enough to really meet the diversity of our need. And we'll have to really make this a collective effort. Thank you.
And
Thanks,
Stefan, you know, thank you so much for that, because I think that this is a huge trap. And I just really want to flag that. I think that the question around who do you really represent, right, is one that I think that is often aimed at racialized communities. We are inherently as diverse as any other communities in this country. And I often feel that there's a lot of on this issue, that there's a lot of justifying that needs to be done. And on some level, we are capable of working across a spectrum, politically, in other ways, but I think the burden of proof around that falls disproportionately communities of color, foundations or organizations of color, and leadership of color. And I just want to just flag that a little bit, because I'm not sure that a group of, for example, I'm just going to go off video.
We had a few technical
Video.
earlier.
I think losing some Wi-Fi of philanthropic leaders of 10 foundations.
I feel like we're in a sci-fi movie right now. So Sadia, I'm gonna ask you to pause that response because it's chopping up. But I think Jaka,
And talk about, who is from the recognized.
Jaka, I think you wanted to say something to that question.
Yeah, it's really disappointing because I was really enjoying what Sadia was sharing. So hopefully she can come back to it. And I think just building on the points that have been said, it's recognizing that Black communities across Canada are not a monolith. Identities are not singular, and recognizing the intersectionality within identities of Black individuals or those who identify as Black within Canada. And I think this foundation, the values that we are working towards in establishing this foundation are really based in an equitable approach, one that is also looking to operate in solidarity with the most marginalized segments of our communities, and definitely not looking to speak on behalf of communities or individuals, but rather elevate voices across Canada, elevate the voices of those who identify as Black. We need to, and we're looking to bring in those different intersectional voices to be a part of this foundation, from the beginning, to help establish as well as to help provide direction, as well as working with other philanthropic foundations to help advance the objectives of Black communities across Canada.
There's a question that we received that could actually speak to a lot of our philanthropic foundation members, so the foundations that are within our scope. Oh, sorry, it just bumped up. Oh, it disappeared. Oh, there we go. So there's concern that there might be just a single voice or a concentration of power within a select few. How do you envisage integrating a diversity of members of the Black community on philanthropic boards? So this is going beyond the idea of BCPF, and how do you see more Black Canadians on boards? So it's a question of going beyond this advisory committee and just amplifying voices within the foundations that are already here as well.
Joseph, do you mind if I give this a crack?
Go right ahead.
Yeah, so I've attended a few PFC meetings, and this is this continual question that I think the sector as a whole struggles with. And I think this goes to the comment I shared earlier around, if the concerned community isn't at the table, then the concerns of that community aren't on the agenda. I don't know if the BCPF or our group is going to, has the, if we had the ability, we would snap our fingers, and I think we'd have the reflective representation that, we think the sector needs. But that really comes down to a few pieces. Number one, how willing are foundations themselves currently, as they're constituted, willing to change, right? Give up power, cede power to those other communities that have been oftentimes sidelined or their issues made tertiary. That's not a question, I think, for us to answer. However, I think one of the things that we could do as a part of our work to develop the BCPF is to ensure that we continue to advocate, we continue to push for better representation on the board. We share the value of why we think a participatory grant-making process is incredibly important to ensure that the needs are met of those different communities. I think a similar approach should be taken across all boards, not only the BCPF board, but that approach for all foundations in writ large rather. And so that's some of the work that we could do. But I think that's already, at least I hope from the conversations where we continue to see, I think that the PCPF, is convening, is that's work that can happen. I think we should be utilizing the moment that we're in right now to really push for those changes. And so I'm reading another question, and sorry to steal your job, Gencio. It was really a question that around sort of, the creating sort of this one-stop shop. that's not what we're intending to do. Again, you know, the philanthropic sector is about $86 billion and over 10,000 foundations and organizations, right? And I think it's going to take sort of a collective push, and we're hoping to be a part of that conversation as a partner. But I think we're also mindful about not sitting here to say we have the answers. That's why we've been speaking to Black Canadians across the country every single day, to make sure that, you know, we're hearing and learning about, you know, those questions we haven't even thought of ourselves. And that was one of the reasons that I think excited all of us to participate today. So as much as you're asking these questions are also then helping illuminate to us where are some of the things that we should be really thinking about and drawing our attention to. So if we don't have the answers, that's because we'll be working with community to figure those out, to ensure that we're not simply, you know, sitting in our own little corners in our isolated ways and relying only on those who we know. We're looking to have that shared learning experience with you all. Thank you.
There's a question that we got here from Nura that I actually want to mix with a tweet that I got in a direct message. Just to sum it up, there's momentum of interest in creating space to discuss the effects of anti-Black racism in many segments of our society. How do we leverage this momentum to create sustainable change? And there was a tweet question that I received too, is how can the philanthropic sector create sustainable change vis-a-vis anti-Black racism? So it's two questions that are somewhat similar. Anyone would like to respond? Sadia, you can try again if you want. We can test it out if you're still R2D2.
Sure. I'm hoping you can hear me now. I am sorry, I think my internet connection is unstable. Are you able to hear me?
You're good, you're good.
Okay, great. You know, this whole one of my greatest fears at this moment,
and we lost her. Sorry, Sadia, it happened again. I mean, this is what happens with technology, right, folks? Welcome to second wave COVID. Canada has Wi-Fi, but we don't have it everywhere. It's not that accessible.
Can you hear me?
It's still cutting. Would anyone with a slightly more stable internet connection want to tackle the question of sustainable change? Sorry, Satya. I'm going to point it out. I'll be like, Jacka, unmute, go for it.
Okay. So I think in regards to, you know, building for more sustainable change, one thing I would point to is first connecting with the leaders in and grassroots organizers and Black-led organizations across Canada and in the States that have been working on these issues for decades. You know, I think one of the things that the comments that I've heard over the last couple months is that, you know, this is somewhat of an awakening for some people around these issues and kind of a not knowing what to do next, where to turn to. And the reality is that there have been people working on these issues for many, many years and have been often doing it with very little resources and very little support. So the steps that we need to take in order to make these sustainable, you know, the first thing is looking to elevate and you know, show a spotlight on the work that has been done and build on that work, you know, resource it, and also looking within our organizations as philanthropic organizations from a critical lens in terms of, you know, racial equity and anti-Black racism lens, anti-Indigenous racism lens, and other you know, and other equity focuses within how are we doing our work to date and what are the changes we need to make in terms of our policies, our governance structures, human resources, you know, all aspects of our organization. So, and actually implementing those changes and really living the values and that we say that we have as foundations when it comes to all aspects of the community. So that's what I would say at that point.
Thanks, Jacka. A bunch of participants are giving great suggestions as to, Saja, why don't you type in the chat box some of your responses? But we're going to try one more time, because why not, Saja? Let's give it.
Okay, we'll try. If this doesn't work, I'll start typing. So I don't know. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So one of my greatest fears at this moment is really that we lose the momentum, and this came up earlier in some of the questions, and that sustained energy and what that takes out of all of us in many different communities, but especially for those within Black philanthropic, those within the Black philanthropic space, but also within Black communities who are dealing with so much at this moment. And there's a role for all of us to actually step up and step behind and step beside, because this momentum cannot be carried by any single group of peoples. It has to require all of us for that sustained push, for that sustained change to take place. So I'm terrified that we're going to lose the momentum, because
We were so close, folks. We were so close.
in such a moment in time, and I feel like there's a real sense of urgency here.
Yeah, we got it. It folded in.
All right.
There's a question here that says, hey, great discussion. Thanks, Lynn. Does BCPF exist yet? Where can I get more information on it? I think a bunch of folks might be asking themselves the same question as Lynn.
Yeah, so we're, the Black Canadian Philanthropic Foundation is already beginning its work. We're about to soon launch our report, and with the report is I think when you'll start seeing a greater public-facing communication. In the meantime, we're happy to give you our contact information so you could learn more about it. We have some upcoming community consultations and town halls that are being scheduled, and we welcome and encourage everybody to participate. That's where we'll be sharing updates about our work and actually going through the our research findings in greater depth. So I think what we can do is we can share that information in the chat group. We can share emails for follow-up, and we can be added to our listserv for updates as they arrive.
And as I mentioned at the onset of our lovely webinar, we send a recording 24 hours after, and in that recording there'll be slides, but we also provide resources links. So all of our panelists have provided us with some links and resources that you're all going to receive as registrants to this wonderful. I'll take, we have 2 last questions. I'm just trying to see the time. I might take one of them. We're hearing a lot, this is from Anonymous. We are hearing a lot about foundations making grants, but what about the role of philanthropy in investing in Black-led businesses, youth-led startups? So yeah, I guess beyond the non-for-profit sector.
That's a great question. I mean, one of the ways that philanthropy as a whole has been really thinking about how to get beyond grant making has been around the push for greater impact investment, right, and greater mission-related investments that are going that allow us to use a larger portion of the foundation's endowments to go towards greater social returns outside of grant making. The Black Canadian Philanthropic Foundation is also looking at creating a very robust mission-related investment strategy that would allow us to think about how we could utilize impact investment opportunities to invest in Black businesses or within initiatives that support Black businesses, including entrepreneurship and youth-led startups. In addition to that, I think that I don't want to oversell the work of the BCPF. I think one of the things that we need to do is also look at what are the other things foundations can do in addition to grant making, in addition to direct investment. That's policy advocacy, right? And I think that goes to another question around recognizing that the priorities, Black bodies, and experiences are in fact inherently political. And in order for us to think about how to address and support communities to overcome their barriers, we need to recognize that many of those barriers sometimes stem from institutional obstructions, and we need to remove those, right? And the BCPF is not going to all by itself, root out housing discrimination in this country, right? We're not going to root out the poor healthcare received by Black women, where the BCPF is not going to root out, the issue around low expectations within school systems experienced by Black students. Those are, in fact, public institution issues, right? And our work is going to be, alongside many, many others, how do we ensure that those policies that are creating negative outcomes for our community are addressed, identified, and removed, right? And sometimes that isn't going to be the foundation's responsibility to lead, but to support, right? And so I think the BCPF can always be counted on to be at those tables. And we recognize that, there are clear limitations around the advocacy work that could be done, but that's not something that affects only the BCPF. I think the philanthropic sector as a whole has been looking at this issue of, how do they make better, how can we utilize our and leverage our space and our location better to ensure that the needs of our community are being addressed. So I think that's a conversation we're happy to enter and be a part of, and to ensure that the Black issue and the Black agenda is centered in those conversations. That's how we intend on working with Black businesses in unconventional ways beyond grant making. That's how we intend on ensuring the policies that are impeding the opportunities for the opportunities and the benefits offered to Black Canadians is also being addressed. Thank you for that question. It's one that we'll continue to think about, and hopefully we can hear from you directly, Anonymous, about ways we can do that. Because oftentimes those who ask questions are seeing things that others aren't. And I think that often also means that there are solutions that you're also thinking about to those very questions you ask. So we welcome you to share your thoughts so that we can strengthen the work we're doing. Thank you.
And we have enough time just for a closing note from each of you. If there's one message that you could give to either foundations or the philanthropic sector, one thing that you want them to remember walking into Thursday tomorrow, and it's almost Friday. I keep saying it's almost Friday. I know it's not yet Friday. But what's one thing that you would say to sector partners and leaders and colleagues? Would you like to go first, Sadia? Let's test it.
Sure.
And the test has passed. You can write it
for all of us, and there's room for more.
I'll ask you to write in the comment section. Joseph, let's go with you. Sorry, Satya.
No problem. Again, amazing responses from the other panelists, and I just feel very blessed and appreciative of being able to share space with all of you today on this very important conversation. As the conversation was going on, there were a number of things I wanted to respond to, but I won't take up the time here now to respond to them. One thing that stands out, though, as a closing remark is just the fact that the BCPF is leading with the presupposition that all communities matter and are inherently dignified and valuable. And when you lead with a presupposition like that, you open yourself up to the fact that you are now going to have to bear witness to your blind spots. And what we've noticed as well on the ground is a lot of community organizers who have tried to receive funds and supports for their niche and their unique things that they want to support within their community often feel like the philanthropic sector exists beyond the chasm, and they're unable to reach out and acquire those supports from the philanthropic sector. And in many respects, the philanthropic sector has a blind eye for those communities and the things that they need because they don't necessarily accommodate those communities in their thinking. And so the goal, I think, is for the sector itself to lead with the same presupposition, that the BCPF is trying to lead with, that all communities matter and they're inherently valuable and dignified and deserving of supports in a variety of ways.
Thanks, Joseph. Just to echo Sadia's beautiful words, there's room for all of us and multiple versions of us. Let's challenge notions that do not recognize our complexity. Love it. Feels like a haiku. I'd wear it on a t-shirt. Jacka, any last words that you'd want to share with our participants?
Yes, so I'd like to direct everyone to the calls to action for philanthropic organizations and the sector at large for shifting structures in Black philanthropy. So these 12 calls to action were developed by a group of Black individuals in philanthropy at the Racial Equity and Justice in Philanthropy Funders Summit, and we will be sharing a link to that after this webinar. But one in particular that I wanted to highlight, one of the calls to action is for philanthropic organizations to publicly take a stand on anti-Black racism, that is grounded in community consultation, name and recognize the experience of Black communities, not as a monolith, but reflective of the diverse communities your organizations serve. So thank you.
And Liban, I'll let you have the last little moment before I do the closing logistical remarks.
Sure. I mean, I'll try to be super brief. The data that I referred to earlier, it's, you know, and I think it'll show in the report as it's released at the end of this month. The numbers are going to be startling for some. They're going to be yawns for others, right? For some, they're going to simply say, we knew this to be true. The level of support that characterizes the relationship between Canadian philanthropy and Black Canadian communities is quite meager, right? There's an inadequate amount of support going to these communities. It needs to be better. The question now is, now that we know what it is in terms of, you know, where the relationship stands, it's a simple question. Is it by design or by accident, right? If it's by accident, if it's an issue of a blind spot, then we can do better. If we don't do better, then it means that this is the way that philanthropy intends on supporting Black Canadian communities. We're at a moment that this is the question ahead of us today, right? I think this is the question that we face as a community. And I would believe, and I hope that the current result that we see is an accident, is an issue of blindness, and one that we're all eager to sort of address. And I think that's a challenge in front of all of us today. And I look forward to the community, the philanthropic community, stepping up, not only to support the Black Canadian philanthropic sector, and not only the Black Canadian community, but I think the conversation we had today talks about the experience of many other equity-seeking groups. So I think we can do better. There's a role that Canadians expect of the philanthropic sector. We're supposed to be the safety net to the safety net. And at this point, we're letting far too many Canadians fall through. We need to strengthen that safety net. We can do better. We must do better. And I believe we will.
Agreed. Love it. I like wish that I wasn't going to say stuff right after you, because that was a great closing. But I just want to thank all of you for joining me today. Some of you know, but this is my last webinar moderation. It was wonderful and splendid. I was glad to have done this last one with all four of you. I thank you again to Rebecca Darwin, who helped organize this, to Merve, who's in the back end helping us, and special shout out to Felicia Tremblay. She's actually a person that's going to be writing a guest blog post from a queer, Black, Indigenous perspective from Montreal, a great community leader from here that's going to look at things from an interesting angle. So check out that blog post that's going to come out next week. And if you enjoyed this, share the recording with your colleagues, with your friends. You'll see it pop up in our YouTube channels. You'll get it automatically, and it will be circulating on our social media. Thank you so much. Every Wednesday, we've got something for you. Next week, it's data. The week after is financial literacy. Lots going on at PFC. We're always here for you. Merci. And thank you for the simultaneous translation. Bye, everyone.